Hi everybody, and welcome to this week's episode on Perks of Being a Teacher. It's been a couple weeks since I've made a new video. I've been pretty busy with work, and I have also just been busy spending quality time with family and friends, but I'm really excited to make a video for you this week. I am deciding to show all of you a lunch and learn that I did with the staff in the past couple weeks. So lunch and learn is required, just like staff are invited to come to my classroom, and during that time we have really great discussion, and I also go over specific topics with the staff. And all the information I'm sharing is based off of the work that I did in my master's, so everything is based off of academic readings and obviously my perception of those readings. So on this episode, I'm going to be specifically talking about positionality, equity, and language use in the classroom. I will be showing you the articles that I use, so if any of you want to learn further about these topics, that there'll be resources shared for you to do so. So this episode is going to be mostly slides, which is similar to the last episode that I made. So I'm going to open up those slides and you can follow along. I really hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. Please leave comments below if you have any questions or comments for me. The question I'm going to start with is, what brings you here? What is it about the topics of positioning, language use, and equity that speaks to you? What is calling you to learn more? For me, my why always comes back to my teaching philosophy, that teaching is a human act, and how one must see the humanity in teaching, that it is humans who we are educating. Seeing the humans in our students is what calls me to better serve both my students and their families. To better serve them, I must critically reflect on my practice to make their educational experiences equitable and just. Before we begin, I'm going to ask you what you expect or want to learn about, and to record it for me. You can leave it in the comment section if you would like me to see what you recorded. Okay. Let's start with a critical reflection. I received these questions in my first course in my master's, and since I have looked through them prior to the beginning of each school year. These questions collectively urge educators to think more critically about how they are positioned in relation to their students. I also give these questions out to students at the beginning of the semester, so they too can reflect on how they are positioned in relation to one another, their teacher, and the society in which they live. If you'd like to answer these questions for yourself, I encourage you to pause the video here so that you may do so. As I speak about positioning, I think it would be valuable to unpack what I mean by positioning or positionality. In completing my master's, my professors often wanted a section in my papers where I stated how I was positioned in relation to the topic I was writing about. Being that most of my work was centered around race, this was a process which grew over the years as I became more educated, aware, and critical of who I am in relation to those who I was writing about. Here you can see my own positioning. The piece about positioning I find most valuable is how it is intersectional, and it is comprised of pieces of both privilege and oppression. The P word of privilege is used in broad strokes, where individuals are not all privilege or all marginalization, but are complex in how we have pieces of privilege, some more than others, and some more obvious than others, and pieces of oppression which too can be more obvious than others. So, why does this matter? The way we are positioned impacts the way in which we see our students and their families. It impacts every move we make, everything we say, and all that we think. It is timely to now ask you to think of your own positioning. You may pause if you'd like to do this exercise. This now brings us to consider how this may impact the way that you teach, the way that you are perceived by both students and colleagues, and how it may impact what you feel you can and cannot talk about in your own classrooms. By considering our own positioning, we can consider how our positioning influences who in our classes is felt to belong and not to belong. My response to this comes from an article by Molnar, which specifically discusses what they call the welcoming of difference. As teachers, we continually strive to find similarities between ourselves and our students. In contrast, the welcoming of difference is meant to encourage teachers to see the difference that exists within their students, to welcome it, not to decrease it, but to celebrate it and to respect it for what it is. The way that we can do this is largely through language use. This ideology of language use comes from Rutenberg's empty chair, where they explain how, at all times, teachers should consider the fact that they have an empty chair inside of their classrooms. They reserve that chair for any individual who could possibly walk into their room. Knowing that any person could walk into their room, sit at that empty chair, and feel as though it is a safe and hospitable space for all individuals can reframe language use so that it is welcoming for everyone, not just for the individuals inside of that space. This idea of the empty chair is something that I also teach to my students. It encourages them to think more critically about the language that they are using inside of my classroom as well. My style is not lists or recipes, but this list is a reflection solely of what I have learned from readings I have done, and it does not encompass what all individuals of these identities necessarily prefer. This is a list I show to my students as a draft, and it is continually evolving. You can specifically see that BIPOC and people of color are crossed out. This is a reflection of the learning that I have done more recently. Initially, this was language that I said was acceptable to use in class, but after reading a few different, honestly, Twitter posts and articles connected to the idea of using BIPOC or person of color, it has been shared with me that it is not specific enough and overgeneralizes the experiences of individuals of different races. An additional note about using BIPOC or person of color is that phrasing of that sort is to be used solely by people who are not white. So often on social media, you see that language used. However, it is coming from people who encompass part of that community. This is, as I said, an evolving list, and what it comes down to is having conversations with students to understand the language that they prefer, language that their families prefer as well. By having open conversations about the language that's used in each specific classroom, teachers can ensure that they are creating a space that invites all identities. Positioning and language use together strive to create classrooms which are just and equitable for students and their families. But how do we know what a just classroom is? And how do we know what an equitable classroom is? It is valuable to firstly define equity. And no, this photo is not being used to describe equity, but rather to critique the use of this photo. Here in the photo, I'm going to ask you, what is being communicated as the problem? The height of the individuals in the photo is demonstrated as the problem, communicating that inequitable conditions are the fault of the individuals fails to address issues related to equity. Rather, this photo should show the ground beneath the individuals as rocky and unstable for some and solid for others. Talking about equity in this way better communicates inequity in that it is not the fault of the individuals that they cannot see the baseball game, for example, but that it is the fault of the way in which structures and systems are designed to further oppress and marginalize some individuals. Work in equity must confront the foundations, structures, systems, and policies which continually reproduce inequitable opportunities and experiences. I can't and won't define for you exactly what equity looks like in schools. It is not a cop-out, but an effort to demonstrate how equity is not something to arrive at or to achieve. It is a continual process of growth, of learning, and relearning in order to better align ourselves as teachers with the humans in our classrooms. Without a critical lens of equitable frameworks for educational systems and individual classrooms, the role that race plays in marginalization and oppression due to inequitable conditions would continue to dismantle the ground beneath students' feet. Paul Gorski does equity-focused work with institutions to bring them to confront their inequitable conditions. He starts by explaining equity detours, which are things that organizations and people do to appear as though they're doing the work, but are actually maintaining the status quo. The first detour he mentions is the pacing for privilege, which refers to the very slow approach to addressing inequitable conditions, in fear of making people feel uncomfortable. Next is the poverty of culture, where individuals claim that, there's not enough culture in this school, and if we infuse more cultural activities, that we are addressing equity. By solely focusing on culture, organizations and teachers fail to actually address race. Next is the deficit ideology, which refers to the idea that we should be fixing students to make them fit into our systems. And lastly, celebrating diversity is something that we can see very often within schools and classrooms and organizations. And it's not that celebrating diversity is a bad thing, but that if we were doing that to say that we're addressing equity, then that is the problem, because celebrating diversity fails to actually address inequitable conditions. In response to these detours, Gorski makes the following suggestions, and he calls them the 5 principles of equity literacy. Firstly is direct confrontation, and he urges educators and leaders to consider, how is racism operating here, specifically referring to policies, curriculum, discipline, and racial biases that exist within individuals. Next is redistribution. This refers to redistribution of opportunities, including learning materials, technology, healthy food, pedagogies, curriculum, and equity-conscious staff. Next is the prioritization, and he urges people to consider, how will this policy impact specifically families of color? Addressing things equally, he shares, produces inequity. Prioritizing the experiences of families of color ensures that equity is being addressed. Next is the equity ideology. Gorski shares that equity is both a lens and an ideological commitment, and he urges that you must understand the dynamics of racism in both societies and schools in order to address equity. And lastly, fix injustice, not kids. I feel like this one is pretty self-explanatory, but the main message is to always strive to eliminate racist conditions and not to try to fix our students. The last thing that I wanted to share with you today as we conclude is this quote from Bell Hooks, and I have used this quote in videos I've made before, but it is truly my favorite, and I think calls all educators, policymakers, administrators, leaders in education to consider how they are positioned in the spaces that they work. I'm going to read it out for you. For me, the space of radical openness is a margin of profound edge. Locating oneself there is difficult yet necessary. It is not a safe place. One is always at risk. One needs a community of resistance. This quote to me is something that I read often and reminds me of the significant amount of work that needs to be done in order to provide students with a more equitable and just education. I really hope that you enjoyed this week's episode on Perks of Being a Teacher. I'm going to ask you to subscribe, comment below if you have anything to share with me, and stay tuned for next week's episode. Yes, there is going to be an episode next week on Perks of Being a Teacher. Bye, everybody.